Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Could you start sharing screens when ready? But hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Yaz, or Yassine, pronouns she and her. I'm a diversity and inclusion specialist with a focus on LGBTQ plus inclusion, but also building anti-racist spaces and doing all of that work through an intersectional lens. And in today's session, we're going to kind of like dive right into the content because there's a little bit to get through, and I want to make sure that we do get through everything and also give you lots of time for questions at the end. Please feel free to put them throughout the questions. Will be Michael, I hope, or Melis, if Melis can join the call, we'll be monitoring the chat. So just to we want, this is your space. This is an opportunity to ask questions you maybe haven't had the chance to ask yet. As it's Black History Month, I am specifically looking at this conversation through the lens of Blackness, and that is kind of relevant to my experience and Chloe's experience as well, who will be joining us in the conversation. But we are hoping that these conversations do continue, that these sessions, we are able to host them with people of other ethnicities and other backgrounds, so we can really bring different perspectives into the conversation. So hopefully this is the start of many opportunities to think about what our anti-racism work can look like and the proactive roles we can take as individuals, but also thinking organizationally as well. Michael will be sharing the presentation.
Yeah, maybe Chloe could just introduce herself briefly first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Sure. I don't mind. It's lovely to meet everyone. My name is Chloe Davies. What shall I lead with here? I'm a mum of two. That's my proudest because my little boy was 5 yesterday, so I'm still on the glow. But I am head of social impact for Lucky Generals, who are a creative agency for people on a mission. Our latest body of work was Virgin Atlantic, which just came out last week. It's Black History Month. We're going to get into this because it's day 4 and I'm tired already. And I'm really delighted to be here. I can see loads of different people from all over the world. It's amazing to have, I think it's about 130 of you here with us. I can't respond in the chat, but I'm saying hi to everybody. So please do send in questions and comments, and Yaz will lead us through.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, Chloe. Okay. Yes, we should be able to see the screen. So I'm just going to run through some of the kind of key terms relating to specifically Black identities and being queer. So I'm not going into loads and loads of details. I'm sure there might be other questions about the terminology we're talking about, but these were some of the key points that I thought would be really relevant and are kind of that I'm seeing increasingly used within Black queer communities and communities of color generally. Then we'll look at a little bit just touching on the past, present, and future of Black queer identities that have existed historically and on through time. And then we'll have a little conversation with Chloe, looking at her experiences specifically in workplaces, but also in life, and thinking about how we navigate our varied identities. And then we'll look at concepts around intersectionality, identity, and decentering those our positions of power and privilege. So we'll touch on those topics as well, and also look at how we can really start to utilize our power and privilege. So moving from shame and guilt to allyship and solidarity, and ending the session with some practical considerations, some practical thinking before we get to your questions. Okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to really start by introducing the concept of what we're talking about when we talk about racism and anti-racism, and moving really from the space of maybe being a little bit more comfortable and apathetic, where we kind of just allow racism to happen around us, to a point where we're taking active steps to challenge it. So I think it's generally agreed, and we can all agree that amongst sociologists and in general kind of societally accepted understandings of race is that it is a social construct, meaning that it's designed to uphold social hierarchies and oppressive social systems. And so it's specifically when we're talking about race, I'm referring to systems of power and oppression and the different access that certain people have based on whatever racial groups they're grouped into. And of course, depending on where you are, racism can look slightly different, but the way I'm talking about it, it's in a Western context, it's in predominantly UK context, actually, based on my experiences, my perspectives. And so this generally, when we're talking about racism in that context, we're specifically referring to systems that uphold white supremacy. So it's about different racial groups sitting in different rungs of a social ladder. with whiteness or those with proximity to whiteness, even within racialized groups, sitting near the top, and those who are darker skinned or who are Black sitting further down on the rungs of the social ladder away from whiteness. And so that manifests a specific kind of racism that we'll be really focusing on today, and that really has informed and shaped my experience of the world. That is called anti-Black racism. So that's something I think we need to highlight. It's important to talk about specifically within the context of racism in general, because that will be framing a lot of our conversation today. So it's vital that as we're starting to move from this point of maybe being passive in the fact of, we're not racist, we're not actively causing harm ourselves, but we want to get to a point where we're actively anti-racist. We're actively challenging racism when we come across it. We are considering our place in the world and how it has been shaped by racist structures. So we need to really think about what action we can take in doing that. And I imagine most of us in this space will be at the starting point of being not racist, of saying, well, I don't, I treat everybody fairly. I don't use, racially insensitive language. I don't judge people based on the color of their skin. And that's a great starting point. I hope that's where most of us are. But at the end of the day, what we really want to get to is a point where we are saying, I may not do those things, but those things are happening. Those things will have shaped and informed the world around us. So what can we actively do to challenge and push back against that and create more just systems for everybody, particularly those who are most marginalized within our Westernized context or whatever society, whatever communities you're in. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, I just want to touch on some of the terms that you might see increasingly, especially over Black History Month, but also just generally as we have these conversations about specific Black queer experiences or experiences of people of color. So the first term I've got up there is Black, because I think obviously we have to kind of highlight that. The B in Black, when you're talking about it, it is capitalized. It is spoken about as a specific experience of an identity, so it is capitalized. And when we're talking about Black, there's many ways in which it has been used in the UK in the 70s and 80s. It was used almost as a political identity. So you had people of other races who would identify as Black under the ways in which they'd been marginalized within society. And today, as I said, we're specifically looking at Black experiences. Some people still identify with that, some people don't. But I think it's important that we are specifically talking about that and framing that as part of the conversation. Then there's POC or BIPOC, which is people of color or Black and Indigenous people of color, depending on where you're based. So that refers to, the reason that this term is increasingly being used, and especially in the UK, we might have heard other terms such as BAME, which is Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, and that's used to group together whole swathes of people with different experiences of racism and different experiences of their race and ethnicities as they move through the UK. And so in some ways, it can be useful to be able to group us together and share our experiences. But in other ways, I think it's vitally important that we're making sure that where possible, we are making those distinctions between different identities. POC or BIPOC is a useful term because it allows people from those racialized communities to be able to find solidarity and similarities in ways of talking about our shared experiences of navigating a majority white space. So that's possibly why you'll see POC being used more frequently, particularly by communities of color, because it allows us to talk about our experience and it's not a term that's been imposed upon us. And then relating closely to that, you might see the term QTPOC or QTI POC or QTI BI POC, which refers to queer, trans, and intersex people of color, or queer, trans, intersex, Black and Indigenous people of color, and again, depending on where you are. So the Black is highlighted in both of those points because, again, we're highlighting the specific experiences of racism that Black people face. And in relation to QTPOC, that will be around the specific experiences of racism and potentially around their LGBTQ plus identities as well. So again, this is a term that is around reclaiming, about centering our experiences of being people of color or Black and other people of color and being queer and being LGBTQ plus within that spectrum. It allows us to talk about our intersectional identities and our intersectional experiences. while centering our race and our gender identities or our sexual orientations. And so it gives us a language to navigate and talk about that. And then another term that I'm seeing, and I also put queer under this umbrella as well, whether it's Black or Black queer with a Q, or the term queer generally. And I'm sure many of you wouldn't necessarily associate that with being solely relating to Black identities or POC identities. But the reason I've put Black and Black queer or queer under this umbrella is because when we look at the term queer, it's very much a fluid term. It's a term that allows us to think about, consider, and explore our identities around sexual orientation and around gender identity for many people. And of course, there is historically, it has been used in a derogatory way, and for many people, it does still hold a lot of pain. But in many ways, I think it's also a very exciting term because it does allow that freedom of exploration. And the term Black with a Q is something that I'm seeing increasingly used, and I think it's quite interesting. And I've seen lots of conversation happening actually throughout lockdown, where a lot of people were talking about the fact that they were able to explore their Black and queer identities in a way that felt outside and separate from the external gaze, from a white gaze, and from a straight or a cis-normative society gaze, cis-normal societal gaze. And we're able to kind of find a way of exploring their identities in that way. So it was a combination of the terms of Black and their Blackness and their queerness. And I thought that was a pretty, it's something that I definitely related to. It's something that a bit of a journey that I went through during lockdown as well, and that I'm still on. But that specific understanding of these things being entwined and forming my identity in a very specific, nuanced way that does relate entirely to my Blackness, but also relates very strongly to who I am as a queer woman as well, or whatever I am. I don't know if I'm a woman on that journey as well. We'll go into that at some point. Cool. Next slide, please. On this slide, I just really wanted to highlight the fact that very often when we're having conversations about Black queer identities, when I'm having them within Black communities, there's this idea that it's a modern thing, that it's something that is, all the kids are just exploring their gender now and everyone's doing different things and this is all new. But of course, we know, and across different cultures, we know that LGBTQ plus people and identities, and especially around different genders and different sexual orientations and different forms of attraction, have existed throughout time and throughout history. So I just wanted to kind of give a platform to that, denote some specific time to just look at a few of the ways in which that has shaped Black identities throughout history. There's evidence, there's a little map in the corner there. There's evidence of tribes who wouldn't denote gender to a child until that child was able to express their own gender. There's an Igbo tribe that would do that in what is now modern day Nigeria, that I think is just a fascinating approach to gender, and that's something that's historically existed. There's evidence of African female husbandry or husbands, where female tribal leaders would take wives as part of their role, almost as assuming or adopting male roles within society. So they would take wives. There's evidence of terminology of same gender relationships, or recognition of those who traverse gender. And in many cases, those people were not only recognized, but held significant roles within society. And so these things go way back. This is nothing new. This is nothing that is a European influence. And I think it is important to highlight that, because I think sometimes as well, when we are in a Western context, looking at the rest of the world, looking at what's happening in places like Africa, we can have this perception that actually, we need to go over there and save things, or we need to change perceptions. And actually, our identities have existed throughout time, throughout history. So it's actually about recognizing that, giving a platform to the people who have existed, and finding connection with those histories as well. And of course, we have incredible activists and people now in the present day who are doing amazing work around and who are leaders of not only LGBTQ plus movements, but Black movements as well. So for example, some of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patricia Cullors and Alicia Garner, who identify as queer women. Of course, in the UK, we've got Lady Phil, who's Lady Phil. And there's also fantastic things happening globally within Black futures as well, with Black queer people, Black queer young people leading the charge and the change, and people like Matthew Blaze and Zaya Wade, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, let's dive into conversation with Chloe so we can frame some of these things a little bit more and dive into some specific workplace-related examples. So Chloe, Chloe's given us a little bit of an intro into all the work she does at different organizations that she works with, but I swear you have like Beyonce hours because you do so many different things. It is wild.
This isn't a therapy session. Don't make me think about it. Don't make me think about all the different things that I do.
So many different things.
I guess context sake, it's good to bring it into this space. So obviously the day job is working for Lucky Generals. I'm head of finance for UK Black Pride. I'm head of relations for London Queer Fashion Show. I'm an ambassador for Mental Health First Aid England and a director for the London LGBT Community Centre, which it was pop-up, but now we're going to be there for 5 years, and that's on Bankside. And I'm a mum of 2. I never thought, kind of leaning into like the intro bit of me, I never really stopped to think about what it was that I was doing. I found community in the different things that I gave my time to and volunteered to, because they helped make me a bit more whole and make me feel a bit more whole, or make me feel like I was seen where I wasn't necessarily seen outside. So that's why I align my skills and my values to those organizations. And I've been part of other ones in previous years that didn't serve me and have left them. So yeah, I think that's why I do as much as I do, although I'm trying to do less, but it's not really working out like that.
Well, in all the work you do, or just in your life in general, how do you find that you reconcile your Blackness and your queerness? Because I know you do bring that into everything you do. You talk about being a proud Black queer woman, a Black bisexual woman. And I don't even like that word reconcile, because I think actually, this is just who you are. So there shouldn't be this point of reconciliation. But have you ever had these moments where you feel like you had to choose one or choose the other? And how do you bring that together into what you do?
I mean, for those who know me or know my story a little bit, and for others who don't, I guess I started at Peter Jones, which was part of the John Lewis Partnership, when I was 16. It's the John Lewis store that's in Sloane Square. And on my first day, they said 1 in 2 men here are gay. So if that's something that you're not comfortable with, this isn't the place for you to work. I'd been out, I'm bisexual, I've been out since I was 15. So working somewhere where my LGBT identity, my queer identity was seen and celebrated and glorified in many different instances within that establishment was great. But I was a manager by the age of 17. And so very much, I'll be really honest, I never really worried about my LGBTQ identity in the workplace. My Blackness and my womanhood were where I came up against serious barriers, because being 17, so being one of the youngest managers in history for John Lewis Partnership, and a Black woman, didn't really resonate quite well with a few other people. It also didn't help at the time that my mum was the only department manager, the only Black department manager within John Lewis. So we already had this case of othering where, oh, well, you're just going to be just like your mum. And I'm like, no, my name's Chloe. And they were like, oh, no, but you're Nicola's daughter. So again, I had like this element of anti-Blackness where, everyone just had one version and they were comfortable with the one version. And so that's what I learned. So when you're talking about like the reconciliation and language, for me is very much like what I've had to unlearn throughout my career. And I'm, very lucky. I've worked really hard to get to where I am, and, being a senior Black woman in many different spaces now, whether that be fashion, whether that be now in advertising, where you don't necessarily see a lot of examples of myself. I think that's why I am the way that I am now, where I just refuse to separate myself to whether I'm palatable, or whether I, what I look like and what I sound like are 2 different things. So I always lull people into false insecurity, because they don't really expect me. You know, you would expect an angry Black woman. You wouldn't really expect me. You know, you wouldn't expect sometimes where I'm faced with conflict and I can talk my way out of it, but someone's expecting me to be disruptive in that space because they're living against the stereotype. And so I found I can't be any other way. It was causing me mental harm because I've done that. I've been in situations where I've separated, you know, where I've separated my Blackness and been so removed from my Blackness that I'm conforming to a whiteness that didn't actually serve me well, or been in situations where I expect better of people because that's the way that I treat people and the way other people have treated me. And then when I don't get that back due to racism, I'm completely disappointed because the idea of me sometimes is hard for people to take. And that might sound really difficult for people to understand, but at 40, I can still walk into a room and people aren't expecting me to be there. My name is traditionally, well, it's French, but my name, I don't lead with my Nigerian name. My Nigerian name is Biola. I don't use it because I'm tired of listening to people not pronounce it correctly, or I get called so many different things. And so it's about now, how do I navigate with comfort? How do I navigate with safety? But also, how do I show up for myself? And I think that that's more important than anything else. We often talk about being your authentic self, but when you carry many different identities and one of them is so visible and not washed off in a world that is not comfortable with racism, it had always been before a choice of how I chose to show up, how I chose to navigate through that, versus now, I hope I'm big enough and I'm grown enough to just not anymore and be unapologetic about that.
Thank you. I love that. And I definitely shared that experience of minimizing myself and then going through this process of going, well, like, how can I live the rest of my life like that? Just like you said, it's mentally harming. Yeah. I wonder, do you have any specific experiences in queer communities specifically where that you're either Blackness or where you haven't felt welcome in the communities in that sense?
I guess mine is the not famous, infamous. I used to volunteer for Pride in London. I was their Deputy Director of Community Engagement, and I left 4 years ago due to the systematic, structural, and very harmful racism that was happening, that the rest of the world found out about when Ramel Affleck and the cab resigned a year ago now. I think there's still an important conversation to be had about Black queer women who have felt harm through Pride in London. And this is my experience, and I can only speak at mine. I'm not going to speak on behalf of others, although that I know there are many. The challenge was so hard for people to understand why, you know, some of the things that I heard, you are Team Chloe and not Brand Pride, that you kind of favor glamorous events, that, you know, you kind of, why did we send Chloe to speak there? Like I was any different to anybody else. And this was a constant, you know, when people volunteer their time for something that gives them a sense of hope, but also that they can feed back into community, because we all recognize that for a lot of people, the very first time you ever saw yourself was in an organization like that. That's really what it meant for me. And it was so hard to be in a space that I thought was designed for me, that was welcoming for me, that celebrated me in all of my rainbow colors, but actually then to understand didn't want to accept me because of my Blackness. And that I was palatable where it benefited them, but not where it benefited myself. And so I find in a lot of queer spaces, there's a harm that we continue to do to each other. You know, if just for this conversation, like, for example, like if I take away my Blackness and have a conversation that's rooted in our trans community, we're having a conversation about the trans community whilst not acknowledging the disproportionate number of Black trans people, our siblings, who are still being killed in numbers. That is absolutely terrifying. And so we still have a duty of care within our own LGBT community to do the work with each other, for each other, and by each other. And it's just understanding that when you put the nuance of race on top of that, that it becomes even more complicated, and we really need to do better on understanding, upholding, and uplifting each other. Because I could be having the same conversation about my South Asian siblings. It's different, but it's still racism.
Oh, thank you for sharing those experiences. And, you know, again, there's several things in there that I can definitely personally relate to. And thank you for also highlighting that point around what else we can do for others in our community who are experiencing perhaps even worse experiences or harder experiences or have a harder journey. And so actually on that point, I want to ask around, as allies or other people in this space who may have some elements of shared identity, who might be LGBTQ plus allies and leaders themselves, so do have a certain understanding of or perhaps their own experiences of being marginalized in some ways and excluded in some ways. So how can we utilize that as a point of empathy to drive our work?
I think the first part is, not everyone is going to like what you have to say, but everybody needs to create the space to listen. You know, that's the first place that we get a point of learning from this. I mean, I can see there's loads of allies on the line. You might not share the same lived experience, but my experience is still valid. You might not understand it. In fact, it might be really hard for you to hear, but it still happened. You know, it's still a trauma that I live with. So try not to center yourself in what you hear, because then that devalues what it is that I'm trying to share and bring into the space, and for that space to be held. So it's often said, listen to hear, don't listen to respond, and really think about what you've heard, and then where can you take that? Which space can you take that to? And it's a constant place of learning. I would hope, in the same way that you have all made the time to listen and hear me, that you do that for others, whether they look like me, whether there are other examples of me, and then you take it to places where we can educate each other, because that's what community does. And we have a duty of care to each other as community to uplift each other and hold each other, but also for the betterment of each other. And that's where we have shared commonality, shared identity. We will all face trials and tribulations at some point, especially if we're talking about it through the lens of our queerness, and then you layer it on top of the lens of our Blackness. So it's really about, what more can you do outside of just October? Where can you take this? What more can you do, you know, all year round in the spaces that you occupy? But also when you hear examples, I guess, of what I'm bringing, and Yaz, you know, what you're bringing from your experiences, when you hear the language that is similar, what can you do to call it out so that we don't have to?
Oh, there's lots there. And there's some really good starting points that I actually want to continue to build on, but particularly just thinking about, as you said, that point around community, and like the fact that actually we're all in this together. And if we do this for one another, when we're uplifting all of us together, we're challenging those bigger systems that put us in certain positions, that tell us that we can't be who we want to be, that we have to hide elements of ourselves. And so actually, in uplifting one another, in uplifting, and as you said, listening, that point is so powerful and so strong to me. We really can open that space up for the general uplifting of our whole community altogether. Have you got any final practical steps that you want to leave us with? There's a couple there already, obviously, in the listening and things, but any additional?
I mean, this is, you know, whilst we all say, you know, we're Black all the time, we're not just Black in February and October, we're not just LGBT in February, October either. Like, take this month as a real place of education, immerse yourself in Black history, Black education. It's to recognize that it's not to center yourself, because this is a time of the year where Black people are at the forefront and really get to have the elevation that they might not get in other times of the year, but actually participate, be a true ally and show up and learn. You know, if you can't go, spread it into your businesses and share knowledge, share information. You're going to get no better time than for the next 27 days of this month. So really use them to the best of your advantage as an individual, but also go and find out what your businesses are doing, what other people around. There are amazing people, you know, who are doing great work. You know, just follow, I do some time, but follow the tags on Instagram. Instagram is my favorite place to just, you know, have fun, chill, but also educate and learn. Hashtag will show you so much, like BHM, Black History Month. Really just go and immerse it, because, you know, this year's theme is a serious one. It's really about, you know, action, not words. It's about the doing. So it's really, what are you gonna do as an individual? What are you gonna do as a business? If you're a leader, what are you gonna do to elevate other people within your business who are a reflection of us? And how do we continue to show community to each other? So yeah, it's time to do the work collectively.
Love that. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for your time. Chloe's going to hang around till the end of the session. So if you've got any questions that you specifically want to ask Chloe, please put them in the chat now. But thank you so much for that. Some really good insights there about some of the practical steps that we can start doing to get involved and to really take ownership of this work as well. So yeah, let's dive into the rest of the content now. I'm going to speed through a couple of the next slides so we can get through some of the final action points. So Michael, if you could share again. Sorry, next slide. You might not have my updated deck, Michael. Next slide, please. So yeah, we're just going to look at the concept of intersectionality. Obviously, that frames very much of like our Black queer experience. Chloe touched on all the other elements of her life as well. The fact that she's a woman, she's a parent, even the workplace responsibilities that she's had. So we can't talk about the concept of anti-racism without really touching on this notion of intersectionality, which is really a tool or a framework that allows us to speak about the multiple identities that we all embody, and which may lead to specific and nuanced experiences of oppression as we move through the world. And I think that the intersectionality does have specific power. It allows us to think about how we engage with one another. It allows us to reflect on our own experiences of marginalization and oppression, but also thinking about where we hold power in society. And through that, we can start to really form those connections and see the similarities in our experiences, but also open up room for the difference. So it really provides us with an opportunity to move from this place of empathy, understanding, trying to find the commonalities in our experience, even if we don't specifically understand what somebody else has been through. And Chloe mentioned at that point around decentering as well, which I think is just vitally important in the conversation, particularly if we're moving to this point of anti-racism, if we're moving to a point of allyship. That is so vital. And I think it's so difficult for many of us to do because, you know, we are thinking about our own experience. We are reflecting on perhaps some of the ways that we've had negative experiences because of elements of our identity. So then when we start thinking about how can I take a step back from that and open up that space for other people, or share my perspectives, share my experiences, share my privilege, my power that I have as well, that can be quite difficult. But I think that's maybe where we start to move to this action point and where we can start to utilize intersectionality as a tool to take that step back and to think about how we can uplift other people around us. Next slide, please. Let's see, I've changed it around quite a bit. Yeah, okay. So let's look at just touching on power and privilege. Of course, again, can't have a conversation around intersectionality or recognizing what we can do as allies without thinking about the power that we hold in society. And what you can see on the screen is a power wheel or wheel of power and privilege. I won't spend loads of time on this slide, but it's something that you can access just Googling Wheel of Power and Privilege online. And I think it's just a really useful tool because it centers power in the middle of it, and then it has different identity strands going off of it. And it allows you to just reflect on where you hold power in society. And I appreciate that as LGBTQ plus people, as queer people, there may be many moments in our lives where we feel like actually we are completely on the edges of society. We are pushed to the margins, that we don't have any access to power. And I think just framing it in this way allows us to maybe, again, take that step back, just reflect on maybe the opportunities that we have had in our lives, and then really focus on those points of where, okay, I had, for example, for me, I've had certain educational opportunities that have given me certain access in life. How can I utilize that access to support other people, to perhaps open up other opportunities for those who may not have the same access, to share any of my knowledge, my learning, and even I utilize it as a way to think about the people within my educational set who will not have had access to anybody who is a queer person or a Black person, and how can I use that to inform them? How can I use my influence in those spaces? So I think it's important to think about how we utilize power, and how we utilize our reflections of our own intersecting identities as well, to think of those moments where we may have felt helpless and where we may have felt like, actually, I do exist specifically on the margins. How can I affect change? Looking at it through this lens allows us to just see that it's not always so clear cut. Power affects us and impacts us differently, but we do hold it in certain ways. So we can think of, where do we hold it? How are our intersecting identities entwined? How have they provided certain opportunities in our lives, and where have they presented barriers? And I think this is just a great way of framing, as I said, these approaches around decentering ourselves, moving from empathy, and moving to a point of action, even though it can be difficult to think about the opportunities we've had or the privileges we've had in life. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at, these are a few more like action points that I wanted to leave us on. And I know that in many ways, like I didn't want to give you a set prescriptive list of, go away and do this and do that, because we all have different contexts. And I think it's important to spend time reflecting on our own context and what we're going to do in those spaces. So this is a list that is more of a maybe broader thinking list of how we can frame our allyship and our solidarity work. And by solidarity, I really want us to move to this point where it's not from a position of being saviors, or we're trying to, when I talk about even utilizing our power, it's not from a point of I'm coming from up here to help you down there. It's recognizing that we are all impacted by the unjust world that we live in. We will all have experiences of marginalization. So how can we find solidarity, find those opportunities to meet people on the same level, rather than having this kind of savior complex? So that's the approach that I want us to take as we think about some of these specific things that we could do in terms of our allyship and our actions. I've put listen up there, which Chloe mentioned as well. And I think it was just, such an obvious starting point, but it's fascinating how many of us don't necessarily do that, or don't really consider it. We think we know things. We may spend a lot of time hearing things, but or listening to things, but are we actually hearing what's being said? Are we hearing what people need us to do as well within that? So when I say listen, it's really just taking a step back to listen to people when they tell you about their experiences, particularly if they're talking about their experiences of oppression and marginalization. I know that in my life, a lot of my white LGBTQ+ friends get quite uncomfortable when I talk about my Black experience and my experiences of racism and racism as a queer person, because it feels like we have a different experience. But I think it's vitally important that you get comfortable with that discomfort and recognizing that, yeah, some of our experiences will be different. That's all the more reason why you need to take action. So really that listening point is, I think, a really solid and really important starting point. And falling into that and kind of tying into that is in education. So really proactively seeking out those opportunities to educate yourself. Sometimes don't just go and talk to your Black friends, your Black queer friends. Sometimes it's really tiring. Sometimes they'll want to talk to you, but they shouldn't be your sole teachers. You need to be taking those proactive steps to find the information that you don't know, to really question your own knowledge and where you've get the information you've been given previously as well. Really building on that, ever expanding that research, that those learning opportunities. You know, it's something that I do myself. I'm learning about the experiences that I don't have, particularly with my queer siblings. I'm trying to figure out and understand how our lives are different, and then how can we find the commonalities within that. This point around redistribute is, I think, vitally important, particularly during Black History Month, where, you know, you'll be asking people to potentially you know, speak at events, or maybe coworkers will be asked to, or employees will be asked to do additional work for Black History Month events and things like that. So it's about really making sure that those events, those people are remunerated in the right ways, that they have appropriate budgets, that they are being recognized for the additional work that they do. But I think when we think about this concept of redistribution, we can also think about our own, the skills we have, the access we have, the opportunities we have, and how we can share that out to other people as well. So really thinking about that in terms of not just wealth and money, but like your time, your skills, other resources that you might have. If you have a space that's available, who can you offer that to? Then there's a point around challenging, and this becomes maybe, it's quite apparent and obvious that we need to really be challenging, you know, things like discrimination and racism when we see it. That is, can be quite difficult, though. I think we are, particularly in a UK context, almost trained to avoid conflict at all costs. And so there really is this point of a process of dealing with that discomfort and challenging things, and thinking about how you make your challenge, making sure that you're always centering the you know, Black queer person in your space, or in your surroundings, but making sure that you are making that challenges and thinking about the impact they're going to have with the challenge that you're making. But also, I think challenging yourself and challenging your own perceptions about race and racism is a real key starting point. And again, something that many of us find difficult to do. Make sure your work is intersectional. Always look for opportunities to embed different perspectives in it. Look around you and think about whose voices aren't present. And this particularly is obviously important during Black History Month, but when we host our Pride events, for example, very often, you know, we're seeing it's the same faces again and again. What are the experiences that we're not hearing of and hearing from? How can we bring those into the conversation? And how can we not just bring them into the conversation? How can we follow their lead in the conversation as well? And then the final point is just champion. And obviously this is this month gives us the opportunity to do that in many ways. Champion Black queer people, champion Black queer communities, champion Black queer businesses, and champion our lives in a very real, genuine, present way. Next slide, please. Okay. And I just want to close on this final point. Again, I want to leave you with a few actions and a few takeaways that I want you to go away thinking about in terms of how your approach is and what you're going to start doing. So I want you to think about starting with this point of self-reflection. I introduced the power wheel. I introduced this concept of intersectionality. I think that really does have to be the starting point, right? Recognizing who you are in the world in relation to others, where you've benefited from racism, even if you experience marginalization and discrimination in other ways. Really taking that time to just stop and think about it. And that's where accountability comes into play, where you are making those connections, and those connections of the experiences of other people that you don't understand, or the opportunities that they won't have had that you have had. Thinking about how being a white person in a predominantly white environment will have benefited you even as a queer person. So that's where accountability starts to come into play. And then moving to that point of action. So in terms of the takeaway today, I want you to go away, just kind of maybe spend some time thinking about these 3 points and what they look like for you. And with that final action point, that can be something as simple as even attending this meeting today. That's the starting point. But what can you take away? Is there, as Chloe mentioned, social media? Is there some people you can go away and follow? We could talk about that afterwards if Chloe has anybody that she wants to share in particular. But, you know, there's just, those actions have to be specific to you. They have to be relevant to you. They have to be things that you can, that are sustainable for you as well. So that makes sense to how you learn, how you engage with information, but just make sure you go away and you do something. And I'd love to hear what people are thinking in terms of that at the end of the session. But I'm going to leave a few minutes now for questions, just because I'm conscious I can see a couple in the Q&A box at the top. Ooh, let's talk about colorism with regards to psychology of color itself. Chloe, do you have any initial thoughts on this?
I mean, that's a big one.
Mhm.
And I guess the first thing I would say is from what lens, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, it's day 4 and we could be having a different conversation about anti-Blackness within our own community. Again, when we look at it through the lens of like the conversation around Black women and women of mixed heritage or who are lighter skinned, and where, like you mentioned, power and privilege and where that comes up, I think that it's a wider, more complicated conversation. And I guess in the nuance of it, I think that would kind of be the steer to the question that's put it. What I don't want to do is to kind of start pointing in a direction that's too broad. But I think that there's a wider conversation that needs to be said in the mainstream that maybe isn't happening as much as it needs to. I would say in particular the conversation around women and Black and brown women of differing ethnicities. I think we need to have a real serious conversation about colorism and where one does and doesn't take up space, especially when we look at it through the lens of dark-skinned women. And so I think in that perspective, that's very much kind of where we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a huge question, really. But as you said, it's about perspectives. Are we talking about this from an external lens through how we are pit against one another by, this society that relies on the putting us against one another? Or are we talking about it about breaking that down for ourselves individually in the ways in which we may have internalized these ideas around, who we are, where we belong in society because of things like colorism.
And also your proximity to your Blackness, like actually do you value and celebrate your Blackness in a way that I'll be really honest, for a lot of time I caused myself harm because I didn't actually really cherish and understand my Blackness. Especially when you grow up in predominantly white spaces, you assimilate to that lifestyle thinking that is a heritage that it's not. So that's why I said at the beginning, there's so much unlearning that needs to come from where you actually stand within the truth of yourself, but that comes from a place of education. I can see one that says, I'm curious to know, Chloe, and I'm not ignoring the others, but I just wanted to kind of do this one. I'm curious to know, Chloe, if you've been told about Gay Man and John Lewis because you're Black, and if they would have made the same statement if you're not. I think far too often Black people are assumed to be homophobic, which I think is hugely problematic. No, the entire brand new set of new starters were told, which that was on the 2nd of October, 1999. The date is ingrained in my head. Because it's very rare that I've seen someone so openly positive to the LGBT community, and they told a room of 50 people. So I don't think it was just said to me because I was Black. They said it to everybody, and they really did show up in solidarity for the LGBT community. I think that when we're talking about homophobia in the Black community, that can't be a separate conversation from religion, because that's a lot of where that's rooted in. When we think about, at least if I use my own experience, it came from having Nigerian, African American parents. It came from the church being very prevalent and the church teaching what it taught at the time about LGBT community, and that in itself being homophobic, that's where that education, knowledge and base came from. That's where my grandparents got, their education and knowledge. It was all very much from the church and where it wasn't positive. So I can only kind of speak for myself, but I don't think they actively went out of their way to point that out. And I think there are many conversations within our own community that we need to be having.
I completely agree. And I feel like you mentioned that point around unlearning. And I feel like I had to do, and still I'm doing a lot of unlearning about, I have an automatic, like when I go into predominantly Black straight spaces, I am immediately on my guard. I'm waiting for somebody to make a comment, for me to feel ostracized, pushed out. And at the end of the day, it's very much based on real life experiences, and there's legitimate reasons as to why I have that approach. But at the same time, I'm starting to recognize how much that actually all it does is damage me and my ability to be myself in those spaces and to feel comfortable around other people who are like me. And very often, I mean, there's enough times when the negativity has come and it's very legitimate and real, but there's majority of the time it is nothing, nothing that I was expecting. None of that negativity has actually come through. And I don't really think about it until after I've left the space and I go, actually, that was completely fine. And all you did was hide yourself in a corner. Yeah. So it is about that. I mean, it's an interesting, again, so much to unpack in that question and the roots of it. But I also think that there is a point there around not making that assumption that communities are going to respond a certain way or that people are going to be a certain way just because they're Black, or even because, like in my case, when I go into African communities, things aren't always automatically going to be that thing. And so there is something to be said about that assumption.
Where's the line between a white ally and turning into a white savior in the centering of oneself?
Yeah.
If you center yourself and your experiences, remember going back to that part where when you hear uncomfortable things and your first reaction is to give an example of when you've gone through something similar instead of just listening to the experience, that's where you turn from ally, who's an ally of active listening, to someone who's becoming a savior of, I can fix it. That's why I said is that, Black History Month is there to center and elevate Black people in the month of October, to have conversations that otherwise outside of the year they often can't have. And so it's to not take up space in these spaces. I mean, I saw a couple of posts on LinkedIn where white DE&I leaders have been asked to speak on Black History Month panels as, an ally, and they're, what should I do in this space? And one just said, give it to a Black person. Like if there's someone said, but isn't that wrong, like for you to be an ally? And he said, I am being an ally because you can find other Black people who are doing this work in this space to bring some real richness to the conversation. And all you have to do is just go and look or ask in your network, or do like some amazing advocates, David McQueen being one of them, who said, look, I get asked to do so many different speaking engagements, but I want to pay it forward to other Black people in community. So if you speak on a particular subject, put it below in the comments, and hopefully all those people that are asking me to speak will come and ask somebody else. So it's about how you can elevate community through the different networks and the opportunities that you have that will elevate Black people at this time. And like I said, it isn't just for October. Hopefully you should be trying to do this for lots of different people if you have the power and the privilege to do so throughout the year.
Absolutely. I love that point. Yeah, I completely agree. It's about your motivations as well. And if you are doing it with this perspective that you need to go in and you have superior knowledge, or that you need to save somebody, or that you are coming from, and I think it's almost like an ingrained natural thing in many Western contexts. And then if you're, in a majority white society, there is this idea that you kind of know better, or your experience is of more value. And I think that is an inherent thing that is taught. And I think it's really difficult to unlearn that. But I think that's the starting point as well, of actually recognizing that, there are incredible, like, Black queer leaders across the globe who are doing incredible work, who are doing that completely outside of whiteness and outside of the gaze of whiteness. And people are sometimes find it really surprising when they do encounter that work, and they encounter the knowledge and the experience and the education that people have, because there's an assumption that, like, okay, you need me to come and save you need me to help you through this. And actually what we need maybe is some support, is maybe some of the resources that you might have, but we don't necessarily need that. Yeah. Okay, we've gone over a minute. Do we have time for one more question, Michael?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. Chloe, what's jumping out?
Okay, how do I, oh no, wait.
Yeah, I like call out and challenge. Is that the one?
Yeah, this one. How do I call out, challenge, and make sure I don't take someone's voice away at the same time, knowing I don't share the same experiences, and at the same time know the marginalized groups shouldn't be the ones constantly doing the work. I think that we just kind of covered that in the bit that we just talked about before, of it's not, you're not doing it for gratitude, you're just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And I think when you come with good intentions, then that will be recognized. So I would hope that kind of answers that, but not to upset Michael, but for the last part, because I think this is the really interesting one. As a white male, I've been managing the Black History Month or managing Black History Month at our company, but unfortunately my white female colleagues aren't taking the launch and coordination seriously. How do I tackle that without repercussion? I mean, this is where we get into real allyship. And often I talk about this in other aspects of my work. Like this isn't a single struggle. We've been on this journey when we talk about the elevation of people and the elevation of human beings. We've been doing it for women for 102 years. We continue to do it for Black and brown people. We really don't do it enough for the disability community, and absolutely not for neurodiversity. So I would be challenging your colleagues to show up for other communities in the same way that they would expect you to show up for them. And really it's about your work colleagues and coming together. And sometimes that conversation has to come peer to peer. And it really needs to come embedded from the top, which is a hard thing to do. But if it is the wider business policy or the wider business ethos, then you have more protection in that. And so that would be my advice. It's not easy advice, but that's the action.
And I would say this, that final point around the repercussion, I guess it depends what specifically you mean or what you're concerned of with that. But to an extent, when you're putting yourself in that position of ally and you're taking a proactive position in leading because perhaps no one else is doing it, then that repercussion is potentially going to happen. And I think it's about kind of fortifying yourself and expecting it and knowing that that's maybe going to be really awkward on some occasions. And that's going to be really frustrating, I'm sure, as well. But that's part of that journey as well. And you're still, if you focus on what your mission is, what your motivation is, why you're doing it, then that almost, it doesn't impact you as much as it might do if you're not certain, or if there's still a bit of a lack of clarity as to what the purpose is. But I'd also say it's about communication and just sharing that why you're doing it, why you feel like this needs to be done, even if there's nobody else in the company to lead it. And then that also highlights the fact that perhaps there isn't anybody else who's comfortable leading it. Why is that? And that's something that you can start to look at outside afterwards as well.
And if it's company policy or you are being encouraged, you have a budget to do that, that also helps with the repercussion and the pushback, because actually then you can go back to the people that have empowered you to be in that space, to do that role, to say, look, these are some of the issues that I'm facing and I need you at a high level to help manage those repercussions. And so that it isn't you that's taking the flak for it.
Okay. We're going to draw it to a close there, I think.
If you think, yeah, is there another question that kind of screams out to you? I mean, I think...
Yeah, sorry. Dante's question, are there any opportunity spaces for LGBTQ plus folk to discuss or address our community's racism and how we can work towards dismantling it? Of course, I'm going to say UK Black Pride. I absolutely going to say UK Black Pride. I'd say this is a safe space where, we've been having those conversations. Yaz and I are having one now. I would also say, like I said before, find amazing people on Instagram that are having those conversations and go and follow where they are. That for me has always been such an amazing one. Chloe Fulani, who's also been on here, she's having amazing conversations. Like, yeah, if you're not in the wider LGBTQ plus movement, then use this as a starting place and follow some of the amazing Black people who've been here, and then go and follow where they are within community.
Mm. And I think this is something, so this is hopefully the start of something that we continue to do with Recreate Space as well. And we've already spoken about how we could expand this specific focus on anti-racism within LGBTQ plus communities for queer leaders as well, specifically. So hopefully there will be a few other opportunities looking at it through different perspectives, different racial backgrounds and heritages and things like that as well, to expand on the conversation. So please do join us again if you do see them pop up, and please keep bringing your questions, because this is really ultimately what the space is for. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, as Chloe. I think the number of people that are still remaining is testament to how kind of much they've valued this space. So yeah, thank you both so much for sharing parts of your story and all your wisdom and experience as well. Thank you all for joining. Our next Queer Leadership 101 will be at the start of November. We'll be looking at how do we actually achieve psychological safety. And this month we've got Queer Perspectives back on the 20th of October. It's exploring Blackness and intersectionality, specifically within Blackness, and Black Pride as well. So please come along to that. We also have an event in London, which is this week on Thursday, which is exploring bi-erasure. And we have an event in Barcelona coming up in the middle of the month as well. So sign up to our newsletter, make sure you put your location in, and that way you'll get the relevant invitations. Okay, go and enjoy your day or your evening, everyone, and we hope to see you back here soon.
Bye.
Everyone.